when we do approach death, the healthier you are, the quicker that process will be, meaning your quality of life leading up to that was decent, versus what we see so much of in the modern industrialized world is that the last decade of your life can just be so much suffering. And we can have a tremendous impact on that.
This is Nate Ramos, and this is the 10,000 Heroes podcast. Today's conversation is with Richard Mandelbaum. Richard is an herbalist and runs a school of herbal medicine called the ArborVitae School of Traditional Herbal Medicine. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking to Richard for this episode. Something that I'll point out to you now, and I think you'll see emerge through our conversation, is my tendency to pose these questions to Richard framed in some kind of binary, some dichotomy. And question after question, he's repackaging those and handing them back to me in a way that makes me reconsider how I was thinking about the problem to begin with. Much of our conversation is centered on holistic health, and Richard unfolds what holistic health might mean to each one of us, but also what it might mean to our communities and what it might mean to society at large.
Thanks, Nate. I just want to jump in with a special request for our listeners today. We recently created our first ever listener survey. The idea is to understand the role we play in our listeners' lives to better serve them. So while I have some guesses as to who is listening and why, I don't actually have the data. And knowing, as they say, is half the battle. So to sweeten the deal, I'm throwing in a hand-painted watercolor postcard to each and every survey respondent. So please check out the show notes, go to the link, click on it, and take this short 11-question, fun, and hopefully inspiring little survey. Get your watercolor postcard and then go on with your merry life. Okay, take it away, Nate and Richard.
Why should someone bother or take the time to use a plant when they would have the same sort of pharmaceutical derived option? Why work with herbs and not just take a pill?
Yeah, it's a great question to start with, Nate. First of all, I would say, I don't really consider myself in the business of trying to convince people. So there's plenty of people already on board. But that said, for people who are a little curious about it and wanting to know more, one of the things that I think I would encourage people to both learn more about and reflect on is that herbal medicine, and more broadly, a more natural and holistic approach to health, isn't just about substitution. So, for instance, to use a metaphor, I have a background in organic and sustainable agriculture as well. Went more on the herbalism path, but it's there as well. And there's something in organic agriculture that's referred to as input substitution. So instead of my nitrogen, my chemical nitrogen fertilizer, what organic thing can I use instead? And instead of the pesticide I'm spraying on my big crop of monoculture tomato plants, what natural, quote unquote, thing can I spray on them instead? And is it going to be just as effective, right? And so that kind of substitution model is really about, I think, trying to, and usually this is unsuccessful, to put a round peg into a square hole. Right. So it's really more about, is the model of health in mainstream society, mainstream healthcare, something that speaks to your needs, or is it not? And it's not dogmatically either one or the other. The vast majority of people I work with are also seeing physicians. They're getting blood work done. In some cases, they may be taking pharmaceuticals for this or that condition. I'm not ideological in my approach. For instance, I might have somebody sit down with me and say, hey, can I work with you on these issues? But, for that condition I have, I'm taking this drug and it actually helps me and I don't want to mess with it. It's like, cool, that's perfect to know. Let's proceed from there, right? So I actually think holistic approaches to health can include pharmaceuticals as almost a subcategory, right? When that actually is helping you, when it speaks to your needs versus it being the paradigm. So it's a paradigm shift versus what can I use instead? And we get that question as herbalists quite a lot. My doctor wants me on Lipitor or some other statin drug to lower my cholesterol. What herb can I use instead? It's like, I'm not going to go there with you. I'm going to talk herbs because there are herbs that can be helpful, but we're going to talk about your diet and your food. We're going to talk about your level of physical activity, which actually a lot of people in the holistic health world don't emphasize enough, is that we're animals and we're meant to move. And it's hard to be healthy without that, emotionally and physically. So we're going to dig into all those things. So if you are truly just looking for what herbal pill do I take instead of, once in a while that might help, but in most cases that's not going to quite answer your needs. And if that's your mindset, maybe you're better off with the pharmaceutical, to be honest, because I'm going to dig into all these other areas.
Well, I wonder if I can tie that back into a point you made earlier, this idea of optimization that's become so popular that it becomes kind of a fetish of like how optimized, how healthy can I be?
So I'm a big believer in organic food, real food, whole food. I don't think pesticides should even be legal, but we live in the world we live in, so we do the best we can depending on our budget and what we have access to. With diet and food, for instance, I see that trend that you're talking about really come to a forefront where it can actually, unintended apologies, but it can feed into a really unhealthy relationship with food and with one's own body image. And I've seen cases where, for instance, people with a history of eating disorders can actually have some damage done by an overemphasis on the micro detailing of what foods they should eat and what foods they should not eat. It just lines itself up, perhaps unintentionally, but very consistently with what's actually a very unhealthy relationship with food. Again, we want to eat real food, whole food. We also want to relax that once in a while. We might have a health condition that makes us need to be really strict about certain things, right? That happens all the time. But apart from that, there's a certain, I think, kind of psychic damage that can overwhelm and overcome any health benefits we get from being too strict and too puritanical and too religious about things, right? And sometimes just stepping outside and taking a walk is actually the healthiest thing you can do. Like, relax on your porch and watch the sunset. And maybe that's more important than any supplement you took that day, right? And we don't want to lose sight of those things too. We don't want to make this all a consumerist, which I think is often a direction it can lead in as well.
I wonder, when you step outside of the mainstream, which from our discussion thus far today, it seems that you position yourself somewhere out there. What do you ground yourself in? What do you use for stability in that landscape? And what gives you assuredness in a position or how to use something?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. And I should say again, the vast majority of people I work with are also engaged with mainstream medicine. I spend a lot of time looking at people's labs and blood work. I find that fascinating and actually very helpful, not to be led by it, but to use it as a tool, which I think is an important distinction to make. But I follow science, I follow studies, read the studies myself versus, press reports about them or press releases. So just to share that. But that said, at its core, what I think herbalism in particular is really about, and that includes for me what we call lifestyle. Not fond of that word, but I don't know an alternative to it. But lifestyle and food that we eat and certainly supplements come into play too. That really the core of that, and to stick with the herbalism in particular, is about our coevolution as a species on the planet. So one of the things that's fascinating to me, and this might be more of a roundabout answer than what you were looking for, Nate, but I'll circle back to your question, is there's a field of science known as zoopharmacognosy, and that is the study of how animals in the wild use natural medicine. 90% of it or more is botanical, it's herbal, but it can also include insects and other things, clays and minerals that animals find in the wild. It's a fascinating area of research that has a lot of documentation behind it. Everything from elephants and primates to insects even use herbal medicine, meaning they seek out particular remedies when they're ill with something, when they're diseased with something, and not at other times. It's not things that are just part of their diet that they come across and consume. It's for very specific medical reasons that they seek these out. So learning about that and reflecting on that, one of the questions that sometimes gets asked about herbalism in particular is, how did we figure all this out, right? And it gets to your question of like, what do you rely on as your source of information, right? What ground are you standing on? What's the foundation of knowledge that you're standing on? And one of those questions that you hear a lot, which is a good question, a natural question to ask, is how did people figure this out? How did they figure out that yarrow does this and lemon balm does that and echinacea does that, right? It's fascinating. And there are multiple answers to that question. But one of the answers, perhaps the answer that actually most fascinates me, is that the question itself is maybe misframed. And actually, if you look at it and you realize that every other species of animal, all the way to the insects, uses herbal medicine, actually, really what's going on here is that we evolved already using herbal medicine. We didn't suddenly discover this as humans. So it's an inherent part of our relationship with the biome and the ecosystem that we're a part of, both locally as well as the earth in general, that really, historically, it's only been about a century that we've forgotten, because even the big pharmaceutical companies of even the early 20th century were spitting out herbal medicines. This is really recent. Really, it's about 100 years or so that it's been severed for us. So for me, it's really about just returning to what's always been the case. So to be more concrete, to answer your question, what I think is actually the most reliable source of information for herbal medicine in particular is tradition. Now, that doesn't mean something that's popular, because there can be, to your point that you made earlier, there can be all sorts of popular stuff that's bullshit, right? Somebody just trying to sell something. But if something's really embedded in a tradition that's lasted for thousands of years, what that really represents is the longest longitudinal epidemiological study, if you will, that human beings have ever engaged in. You're talking about like thousands and thousands of practitioners, generation after generation, passing on knowledge, honing it so that we know what this remedy does. We know what dosage is safe. We know what the contraindications are. So one of the frameworks I use, for instance, because the herbalists I studied with practice this as well, as traditional Chinese medicine. And you look to that, and it's very consistent. There's always differences of opinion. That's going to always be true. But there's a very strong degree of reliability that we know what these remedies do, because it's been thousands of years of people checking that and using it and correcting it if it needs a correction. It's very, very reliable. It's not foolproof. Nothing's foolproof. But that is actually the most reliable source of information for herbal medicine. And that's something that's completely lacking when we're talking about pharmaceuticals, or for that matter, modern invented supplements, right? In isolated nutrients or that kind of thing, where we don't know because we've never done it before, right? And that's where science is really important. I think science is important for all of it, and I encourage that. But that tradition is actually really reliable. And again, we have to separate that from popular use, which sometimes is not embedded in any tradition. But that's actually where I come from with it. And then the science is not only icing on the cake, it's incredibly complementary and important. And I wish we had budgeting for scientific research that didn't all get funneled to things that were going to make the highest profit, but actually mattered the most to people's health. And if that were the case, we'd see herbs get researched a whole lot more than they are.
I have a couple follow-up questions, but I do want to point out, I'm delighted with both sides of your answer to that. And we're having this little dance here. Well, I'll ask you a question. And my experience is then the answer comes from this much broader, more integrated perspective that kind of puts the question itself into a new context. And that's kind of been the process of the interview so far. So just to say, your roundabout answer is just as satisfying as the concrete answer. Back to this 1,000 years of the longitudinal studies of tradition, would you say that there's a fair amount of lore sometimes tied up in that? And then what is the potential for copying errors, perhaps? And is this where the intersection of science and peer-reviewed studies assist you in helping you do your job better?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's multiple layers there we could unpack. To start with, you mentioned the word lore. So, one thing I think I was talking about tradition earlier. It's good to acknowledge that not all tradition is good, right? Some things we're really glad are in the past and we want to throw out the window and have resulted in really harsh conditions for whether it's women or trans people or queer folks, or we could run down the list, racial minorities, right? Just because something's tradition doesn't mean it's good is the point. And there are, even within herbal medicine, sometimes you see that, like, oh, this is a men's herb. Sometimes you see that kind of association with an herb that was highly prized and expensive and rare and valuable. It's like, is that really like a quote unquote men's herb, or was it just not something accessible to other people, right? So you do see some of that you have to be careful for and careful about. And it's really exciting, actually, to me, to be an herbalist at a time when there's so much social change bubbling up, including within herbal medicine, to question those paradigms. And there's a lot of questioning of, for instance, like heteronormative and genderized language within herbal medicine, just as one example, or decolonizing herbalism. As you look around, and I mean, I'm a white guy myself. Like you see that the spokespeople, if you will, kind of dominated by that demographic versus really representing who's out there doing it, right? So you see the same social dynamics within herbalism that you can see within society. And we have to be careful about that and not just treat that as gospel, right? It's something to be questioned. So I agree. We have to be skeptical in a healthy way, that way inwardly towards ourselves. Another thing I've learned to be kind of inwardly skeptical about, and by inwardly, I mean, not just myself personally, but my circle of herbal community, if you will, is a lot of people will cherry pick science, and they will cite studies that are flimsy and weak, and maybe just in vitro studies or animal studies that were never replicated, or a clinical trial that was uncontrolled and it was only 6 people for 3 weeks. But if it has the result that can further their argument, they're going to cite it in their article or their class or something like that. And that's not something we want to do either, right? We want to be informed and educated enough about the scientific process, and also intellectually honest enough to say, no, that doesn't pass muster. So that happens a lot. So again, I actually am very supportive of really well done science on herbalism. And there's some things that tradition can never answer for us, like how herbs and drugs might interact with each other, right? Or other things that are kind of more modern specific. So in my mind, it's all for the good. And one challenge we have in the United States, at least, I don't know if you have listeners outside the US, but certainly here in the US, the mainstream is so biased against herbs that it's very hard to find published research in at least the more prominent journals that's unbiased. It's very easy to publish an article that's got negative results on an herb. For instance, the National Institutes of Health has a website and an email newsletter on complementary health. It's god-awful, in my opinion. It's so horribly biased. And that's unfortunate, because that doesn't have to be the case. And that's not true in other countries around the world, right? We're in a particularly challenging place, maybe not the worst place for herbalism by any means, where the mainstream institutions at least are kind of lined up against us, which is unfortunate.
I think probably bears amplifying or repeating that there's, I think, a real integral approach to everything you're saying and how you look at these things, that there's something to be valued in the past and the tradition. And there's thousands of years of sort of data or anecdata to support it, but that to subject it to the rigor of science, to do good science, is still something that is important to you as a professional, as a practitioner.
I think so. I think we only benefit if we use it as a tool. I think, again, science is a tool. It doesn't have to be our paradigm, right? But it can be a tool. And if you're a carpenter, or you do, like me, kind of weekend warrior carpentry, that kind of thing, a tool is something that you pull out when it's the appropriate tool. When it's the wrong tool, it's only going to get in the way and make things worse. And you put it back and put it away. So I think we can use scientific research as a tool that way. And if we do, I think it's incredibly valuable. Just like using blood work, when I'm working with a client, maybe I'm oversimplifying this, but I'm not driven by that. I'm not going to read somebody's blood work as if that's them. And I think that kind of paint by numbers approach maybe is something that happens too often in mainstream medicine, partly because there isn't the time, right? So you don't have a lengthy conversation. You just quickly scan things. But to use it as a tool is incredibly helpful. And there's a lot more that we can do that way and also learn that way. And yeah, absolutely. Scientific research on herbs, the more the better. Again, what's unfortunate is when it's biased, that can cause more harm than good. But when it's unbiased and kind of intellectually neutral and honest, not every herbalist agrees with me on this. Some are very much just in the science only camp. Others are like, forget that's not my world. I don't want to have anything to do with it. I think there is actually a kind of more nuanced truth to it.
Yeah. And it's a nuanced, I can feel like we're sort of like treading in dangerous territory, that if we like take a step in the wrong direction, I'm going to get kicked off Spotify. But
should I say some trigger words for Spotify, especially this week, as they, yeah.
I'll ask you this. Do you see that there's become sort of a distrust of science, of medicine, as is practiced in the mainstream? And the tendency then is to just run away from it, but there's not really anywhere coherent to run to. So then people are kind of left in the wilds of the internet and fending for themselves. Why do you suppose people have lost trust, if you suppose that?
Yeah. And again, feel free, Nate, to edit any of this out if you think I'm going to get things in trouble. But I'll tell you one thing I was thinking about recently, actually, is especially with COVID, right? Let's just kind of call out the elephant in the room here. We're seeing such a divisiveness and such, varying responses and public stances towards science, quote unquote, sometimes quite hypocritical. Because in reality, most of those people, whichever side you're on, you're going to cherry pick what you want, right? And ignore what tells you something different. And that's the opposite of a scientific approach, actually, right? No matter what your own personal opinions are, put that aside and observe and acknowledge your own biases, because that's the first step. We all are biased, right? There's no such thing as an unbiased person. So acknowledging your own bias in all of it, and then trying to counter that, trying to make up for that, trying to take that into account as you look around, that's the best we can do, right? And so, for instance, over the past 2 years with all of this going on, one metaphor I've thought about is there's a whole bunch of people trying so hard not to drink a glass of Kool-Aid handed to them from these people over here, that they're guzzling a gallon of the Kool-Aid handed by these other people over here, right? So I have found it really interesting to be in a position where, if you ask me, am I going to just trust everything the FDA and the CDC come out and say? No, definitely not. There's so much political corruption. There's so much of a revolving door between for-profit businesses and the pharmaceutical industry and the FDA. I work a lot with Lyme, and you look at the CDC's positions on chronic Lyme, and it is so outdated and so harmful to a lot of people who are suffering, right? So I get it. And at the same time, a lot of the people who are critical of that and critiquing that in a sensible way are, like I'm saying, just kind of turning around in the other direction and swallowing whatever gets thrown at them without applying the same level of scrutiny and skepticism towards that. And that's a more difficult or challenging position to be in, I think, in general. Because I think human beings are really good at choosing sides. What side are you on? It's binary. It's A or B. And it's often not the case. The truth is often more layered than that. And COVID is a perfect example of that, right? Where we can, I think, if we challenge ourselves to have a healthy skepticism of institutions that have a political bent to them, that are not just pure science, but that doesn't mean everything that comes out of them is a falsehood. And it doesn't mean that everything that comes out of the people who are over on the other side is true, because that's very much not the case. And to your point you made earlier, sometimes that's also just hucksterism on that side, particularly if people are trying to sell something. And so I think we need to up our game a little bit in all this. And a true skeptic is going to be skeptical in 360 degrees, not just 180. And I see a whole lot of that happening on both sides, right? Where there's skepticism towards the other side, and versus like, let's look at this more holistically and just see what the facts are. Actually, everybody likes to claim that, and I guess I'm claiming that now too. So maybe someone would criticize me for the same thing, right? But I think that's where we need to have an ambition towards, at least.
Sure. And you said 360 degrees, and it's maybe also some skepticism of where the point of the compass itself. You said something about kind of being aware of your own bias, your collection of biases, that maybe good critical thinking isn't just being, applying that critical lens in just one direction or multiple directions, but also being aware of kind of how you're processing, what filters you're using to make these decisions.
Yeah. Well said.
You said something else earlier that I wanted to probe you on. You just made a distinction, it seemed like, between science as a process and science as a paradigm. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay, can you say more?
Yeah. I think there is, and it depends how we define science, so we could veer off in that direction. But I think that understanding what questions science is a tool to answer and what it's not is important. So, for instance, I don't consider myself to be personally religious. Am I a spiritual person? That would be an interesting conversation to have, but we can put that aside for the second. But you hear folks talk about who are scientists as well as deeply practicing a religion, and they'll say, these are just different tools for different purposes, right? Like there's certain things science can answer and certain things it's not even designed to answer. It isn't answerable within science. So we shouldn't try to put it to that way. So you can have a broader cosmology and view of what this is all about or what your place in it is that doesn't translate to a scientifically answerable question. So that's one aspect of it, I think. Another aspect is, there's a herbalist out in Colorado named Lisa Ganora. So I want to give her credit because I'm going to share something that she has said. So it doesn't come from me, but I think it's very well said that reductionism is an excellent tool, but a horrible worldview. I'm paraphrasing. And by reductionism, what we mean is reducing everything to its component parts. That's kind of what a clinical trial does, for instance, like a controlled trial with a placebo group and so on and so forth. You're trying to account for all the factors and reduce it to this one thing that you're looking for. We'll never be perfect about it, but you try your best to do that. That can actually be a very helpful tool to learn something. But if your worldview is that everything can be reduced to its component parts, then we start getting into, to stick to the topic of health, because I think that's the focus of what we're talking about. You can, if you approach health from a fundamentally reductionist view, then you tend to think that you can piecemeal address things. So your LDL is elevated, let's address that, right? Your thyroid function is off, let's address that, versus looking for what's going on more systemically or holistically within somebody and what you can do about it. And even within that, if you look at, for instance, that goal of, say, reducing cholesterol, right? So, I mean, it's maybe a little bit better than it was 10 years ago, but I'll still get plenty of people who are like, oh, my doctor told me my cholesterol is too high and they want me on statins and I don't want to go on statins. So what can you do as an herbalist, right? Totally fair to be seeking out alternatives that way. But it's like, whoa, let's slow down, because the focus on LDL cholesterol, right? So if your LDL is high, in particular, if it's high in relationship to your HDL, if that ratio is off, and we could dig even deeper into that, but not to bore you with more details unless you want to go there, that if that's off, that yes, that can be a biomarker for increased risk of heart attack and stroke, right? So, okay, pay attention to that. The reason that gets so much attention is because there are these highly profit-making statin drugs that lower your LDL cholesterol, right? A lot of the things that actually promote heart health and prevent equally, if not more, a heart attack or stroke don't get nearly as much attention as that, because they're not solved by a reductionist model of one specific pharmaceutical you take, right? So we miss things like what foods are healthy, what lifestyle is healthy, being active, right? Addressing emotional well-being and sleep quality, all of which impact our risk of a heart attack and stroke at least as much, if not, I think in many cases, at least more than what our LDL cholesterol number is. But that reductionist approach takes over, right? It takes over. And that's kind of the medical model we have. Again, I alluded to it earlier as like a paint by numbers approach, right? Oh, your LDL is too high. Here's a statin drug to lower the LDL, right? Versus, okay, you might be at increased risk for a heart attack because of the numbers I'm seeing on this page. Let's address your heart health. Let's talk about your food. Let's talk about your lifestyle. Let's talk about your stress levels, your emotional well-being. Let's talk about if you have a mindfulness practice or not. Let's talk about if you take walks in beautiful places or not, right? Let's talk about if you're fulfilled, if your heart is full with what you do in life. And if not, can you start reflecting on that, which you probably have been, right? But that all of those things, which are going to equally, and again, I would say much more so, impact your risk of a heart attack or stroke. Like, yeah, let's pay attention to cholesterol too. But that's a tool. That's something to pull out of the toolbox and put back in. That's one little thing within this big whole picture, right? So that's where the reductionism can come into play as a helpful tool. And yeah, are there herbs that can reduce your LDL cholesterol? Is that garlic? Is that Google? Is that red yeast rice? Like, let's talk about those things, but within that whole framework, or else we're just painting by numbers and just substituting supplements for pharmaceuticals. And I'm not sure how much that's really worth at the end of the day.
And does it sort of result in a whack-a-mole process? It seems like, or maybe I'm reducing what you're saying a bit by saying that. But when we go off chasing sort of these biomarkers or symptoms, that we kind of end up in this perpetual cycle of solving for one only to watch it emerge somewhere else.
I think we can. Yeah, I think in some cases for sure. And again, I think it's valuable if like you get your blood work back. And I think it's all with good intentions, by the way, that a doctor might say to you, hey, if this doesn't improve, I want you on statins. And they might say in their defense, like, tell you to exercise more and eat better. But like, are they going to really review that with you and dig into it and figure out what works for you? No, because they're part of a system where they don't even have the option to spend that much time with you, unless it's a boutique doctor that you're paying out of pocket for, which if you can afford, good for you, but a lot of people can't, right? So it starts to be, to your point, kind of chasing numbers, right? Versus kind of stepping back and seeing, okay, what is this? If this is a red flag that tells you to worry about something and address it, that's a good thing. So again, I think a lot of times, if not the vast majority of the time, the intentions on the part of physicians are good ones, right? When they tell you, hey, your cholesterol's too high, I want you on statins. I don't think they're acting in an individually corrupt way in any sense. I think they're actually, looking out for your well-being in the way that they know how to. And it's not even that statins can't be a part of that if you choose for it to be. But this kind of gets to trying to be less ideological about these things. I had a client just the other day who's on statins and doesn't want to get off. It's like, okay, so we're going to do this. And other clients where like, I want to avoid using those statins, or I want to get off the statin. Okay, let's work with you, because that's your choice, right? It's not mine. It's not your doctor's. Kind of honoring that we can make different decisions, and it's not about judging those as being right or wrong, I think is really important too.
Sure. And there's the other side. We talk a lot about relieving symptoms and healing, and a little bit about the self-absorption that can come from kind of a consumerist mentality of longevity or health optimization. Seems like we could end up running in the same, getting the perfect testosterone levels and doing our blood work. And obviously, I think maybe this is actually maybe the central question. Like you said, we're talking about health, and maybe it's just time to ask you, what is health? What is good health? In a sense, we're all aging. We're all going to die. Some people, maybe not Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there, I know that there's a certain slice of the population now that has become quite fixated on longevity and prolonging life, and I guess prolonging the period of life that's actually like quality life. So prolonging certain like athletic performance. And yeah, I wonder where all of this registers with you in terms of just an individual seeking good health, what good health in a holistic sense means, and where some of these incentives might come into play.
Yeah, no, that's all really well put. And I'm tempted to veer off in this very philosophical way, talking about the fear of death and how intrinsic to our society that is. I won't go there, but I'm tempted to, because I think it's huge, actually.
I don't mind going there, but I would like more of maybe you could respond to the second thought, and then maybe we could loop back to that deeper philosophical question.
Sure thing. Yeah. Because I don't want to just stay way up in the clouds and not be concrete about things. I think one thing you said jumped out at me, which was quality of life, because we can become so obsessed with the duration, right, of life, our longevity, versus the quality. And actually, one thing I find really interesting is that if you look at the impact that we can have on our own health through the choices we make, and just want to pause and say, a lot of things a lot of people don't have choices about, right? There are a lot of people who don't have the ability to just like, quote unquote, eat better, and, go to the gym, and right. Like, these are also privileges that some of us have and some of us don't. That said, to the extent we have those choices and we try to make them, one thing I find interesting, which I think, just from what I've reviewed myself in terms of the science, is that we have actually much less impact on our lifespan. We have some, right? Do we smoke or not? Do we drink too much or not? Do we exercise or not? We could go down the list. We certainly can impact how long we live, but it kind of is less than, at least I would think it would be. What we really have an impact on, much more so, in my opinion, and much more significant, is the quality of life. And maybe this ties into that fear of death, because, if we're so fearful of death, we want to be alive even if we're suffering. And that's an individual choice. I don't want to question that for anybody. But that said, I think one does lead to the other. We can have a tremendous impact on our quality of life. So as we get older, are we going to suffer, Or are we things are going to happen. Aches and pains are going to come up. We're not going to be as mobile as we used to be. Maybe our mind is going to get a little more sluggish, right? Things are going to happen, but it's going to be in a controlled and tempered way. And when we do approach death, and this is a really interesting thing, if you look at the statistics of people as they age into their late 70s and 80s and 90s in particular. And of course, we could talk about centenarians even more so. But when they do pass, it happens quickly. It happens quick. The healthier you are, the quicker that process will be when it comes. So the decline at the end will be quick, meaning your quality of life leading up to that was decent, right? You were in there doing your thing, versus what we see so much of in the United States and the modern industrialized world is that the last decade of your life can just be so much suffering. And we can have a tremendous impact on that. And that's often what I think we ought to be more focused on, rather than, what that number is that we hit, right? How long we live, which is important, of course, not to diminish it. I want to live as long as the next person, maybe not as Elon Musk, but I want to live healthy. I want to feel good. I don't want to deny the fact that I'm aging. I'm 51. I can't do what I did when I was 21. Of course not. Right. That's pure denial if we want to deny that. But I'm still out there doing my thing, and went cross country skiing yesterday and went to the gym this morning, and I'm doing my thing, right? And maybe that's less intensive than it was, and that's fine. But I want to keep doing that. And that's what I think our goal ought to be.
So I'll just give you the permission slip to go further, if you're inclined to, in terms of the existential terror that perhaps we all live with, and how that may or may not inform the frenzy and compulsion that we pursue our life with. But I wonder, if also this is your answer here might tie into some of our other thoughts and exchanges regarding the pandemic, regarding how we make sense of the information that's available to us.
I'm not a practicing Buddhist whatsoever. I've got friends who are. That's kind of a joke, but I do. Buddha said that self is an illusion, and I do. I'll ride those coattails. I think he was right. I think there's a lot in modern life, but clearly it was true back then too, or he wouldn't have had a need to point it out. That points us in the direction of thinking of ourselves as entities, right? As kind of inherent entities. And we're really part of this billions of years long evolutionary process. And one thing I've reflected on is that without death, we wouldn't be here, right? Evolution and natural selection relies upon the passing of generations. There's, sex and death. Without sex and death, there's not evolution. Without evolution, there's no adaptation. Without adaptation, there's no life. So to deny death as being an integral part of that, and a piece of that can't be just carved out of it and thrown aside, is kind of denying how we got here in the first place and what we are. And again, my own bias, we talked about acknowledging our own biases. My own bias is biological, meaning seeing myself and trying to reestablish that relationship with the plants, with the other animals, with the planet itself. We're a piece of this. And we have such a strong cultural teaching that is, bubbling subliminally under the surface all the time to reinforce the fact that we're individuals, that what matters is me. I matter. So the more that I think I matter in this capital letter way, right? Me, I, my ego, myself. This is what's of supreme importance, that what I am on the planet and in the universe is me in this form, in this lifespan, more than anything else. Fuck yeah, I'm going to fear death, right? I'm going to fear death if that's my approach. But if we let that go and we realize we're just part of this whole process, and that death is is part of what brought us here and part of what's going to keep it all moving. It's just a piece of it. We could use cliches like life and death are two sides of the same coin. I think that's true. We can't have one without the other. So to talk about life without death, I think is, even if Elon Musk can achieve what he wants and figure out some way for that body not to die, at some point he's going to figure out that was a horrible mistake. And if we do that as a species, we're going to probably as a species figure out that that's a horrible mistake, because we're no longer going to be resilient. We're no longer going to be changing it up. Socially, culturally, look what happens when a young generation comes up. They point out all of the crap that we old people are doing that needs to change, right? And then when they're old, the young folks are going to do it to them. And that's just what has to happen, right? But biologically, that's happening too. We're just constantly shifting and changing and transforming and evolving so that we're resilient. Because once we're static, then there's no future for us anymore, right? So passing on and dying is all part of it. For me, it's just part of who we are and what has to happen. And I think, one thing personally that maybe shifted this for me or has helped me in this is having a pretty close near-death experience when I was fairly young, when I was 16. So, that may have helped me kind of arrive at some of this, I think. But, and it's not to say that I want it to happen anytime soon. I want to live as long as I possibly can. When that moment comes, I'm going to probably wish it that I could be here a bit longer. I think that's all natural, right? For that to happen. But in terms of like what's underpinning our understanding of who we are and what this is all about and what health is all about, that it's not about eternal life. It's about, feeling good while we're here and feeling a resonance and feeling fulfilled and feeling loved and getting by, or hopefully more than getting by. I think that that can inform all of that for us.
Well, you threw it out there, and I have to ask. You said this near-death experience. I'm wondering if you'd care to share the story or elaborate a little bit on that. Yeah.
Yeah, sure I can. And it's funny, Nate, because I have no idea, like, how much did that change me? I don't know. Maybe I'd be similar without it. But so I'm just going to be upfront about that. But that said, I was in a car accident when I was 16. My best friend was driving. There were 5 of us in the car. Long story short, single car accident, young driver, stupid driving. And 2 of us walked away. Well, one person actually got carried away, but 2 of us lived and 3 people died. And I was there for it, right? I was there and awake and saw all of that. So yeah, I have to think that helped me realize, like, this can end any moment, for sure.
You were conscious throughout the incident. You never lost consciousness, you said.
I think I went out for a few seconds, but that's about it.
Something that's come up, sort of a recurring theme as we get into some of these personal experiences with the guests, is I always wonder, there seems to be some pivotal moment like this that could have kind of gone either way. If that ended up becoming a horrible trauma that you carried with you for the rest of your life and impeded you in some way, you'd have every reason. But at least the way you're sharing it now, and perhaps that's due to a fair amount of personal work on your part. But what do you suppose, in your own processing of this and contextualizing it, sounds like is informing a very positive, enriched worldview?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'd be lying if I said I knew the answer to that. I can, to use your words, dance around it a little bit and share my thoughts about it. First of all, I do consider myself privileged. Had loving parents, growing up, and support system, comfortable life, pretty middle class, but very comfortable. Things that not everybody has. How much that mattered. I'm sure it mattered, right? So I want to acknowledge that for sure. But apart from that, I mean, definitely a lot of work. One of the things that just a couple years after that I feel like is a really pivotal movement in my life, which I don't talk about a lot, by the way. These are not secrets either. And I bring them up, and sometimes with students and people in my personal life know about this, but it's not things that I just go around talking about either. So just want to acknowledge that too. But a couple of years after that happened, so kind of in my late teens, 19-ish, something like that, I found myself in a sweat ceremony. And again, I'm not of Native American heritage. I went into it with no expectations other than curiosity. Like, let's see what this is about. And had a completely transformative experience. And I'm tying these two things together, but maybe that's my own narrative of it too. But to answer your question as best as I can. And this was a sweat ceremony that was traditional, meaning it was really hot, right? This wasn't a tourist sweat ceremony. This was intense.
Kind of near-death experience in its own right.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because throughout the whole ceremony inside, it was incredibly intense. But I was me, like, again, kind of talking about ego, like I was me sitting there appreciating it. And then for whatever reason, when we stepped outside, it was wintertime and there was snow on the ground. So it's like that, real contrast to the body. I just was sent somewhere else, just boom, out of the blue. And people who were with me, the folks who were with me, some of them were quite worried about me, actually, because I was like mostly naked, standing out there in the snow, barefoot, the cold winter air, like somewhere else. And I could hear, I wasn't that somewhere else that I didn't know what was going on. Like some people were quite worried. And luckily there were people around who were like, no, he's okay, actually. Let him be. Maybe they put a blanket around me. I'm not sure, but right. Like, you don't need to interrupt this. And the trees were all just singing. And the stars were all just singing. Like everything was alive. It was all alive. And I should say there was nothing in the ceremony that was psychotropic. I mean, the ceremony itself was, right? But that was it. So just to mention that too. And that's really just informed me. Informed is the wrong word, right? But just really kind of filled me in terms of how I see myself and how I see the world. Like we're just this equally important as any other little part, but just little part of it. And we get so caught up in what's human with a capital H, what's part of just our own circle or our own modern society. And, people have known for thousands of years, right, that this is all true, that we're just surrounded by life and the rocks, the trees, and that the division that we create between us and them is really artificial. And I think without hopefully being too simplistic, this kind of Western Judeo-Christian heritage has just doubled down on all of that, right? That there's this division, there's this gap between us and all of that. And I had to have that hit over my head to break that down. But I think ultimately that's helped me tremendously through all of that. So, you asked in your question kind of what's helped me process all of that versus feeling it as trauma. And I'm not saying the trauma isn't there. That would be not true either. But I think recognizing what's really going on here and what we're a part of for me personally, it's more healing than anything else.
Richard, in this conversation, you've given us such a great vision of a great picture of what, at least for me, clear understanding of what someone might mean when they say holistic, and this spirit of holism, how it can inform health in not just a sort of quantitative way, but as an actual direct experience of being alive and being connected with the rest of life. I didn't hear you say the word community necessarily earlier, but at several points in this conversation, I got the notion that a pursuit of health is not something we can just do for ourselves. Somehow this connection to the other humans, but also to the plants and to the rest of the, I say natural world, but to life itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very well said, I think. And I had no idea that our conversation was going to go in that direction. And I'm sure beneath the surface, part of it was just from the small amount that we know each other and have talked about things. I know that you're someone who is tapped into, right? Like we tap into a sugar maple tree to get the sap out of it to turn into syrup, right? You're tapped into that. Like I know that you are. And it's probably something you've talked about on your podcast, but that maybe behind the scenes kind of created an environment to open up to these things. So I appreciate that. And thank you for that.
Rich, I just really thank you for your time. This was really an enlightening, very enjoyable conversation. And thank you. Thank you for coming on the show.
That concludes another episode of the 10,000 Heroes Show. Thank you for listening to Nate's interview with Richard. And as always, our hope is to inspire reflection, insight, and lasting transformation. I also have a special request for you today. I just want to reiterate, we recently created our first ever listener survey. Please take it. It is short. It is sweet. It is 11 questions. You will get a hand-painted watercolor postcard if you want one at the end. We would love to know who is listening to the show, why, where you are in your journey, and how we can best accompany you. So please, go to the show notes, click on the link, open it, answer the 11 questions, hit submit, and then sit back, relax, and enjoy a job well done. Of course, I'm always hungry to hear how this interview has affected your life. If you run any experiments as a result of this show, whether it's with herbs, your doctor, how you read scientific papers, or anything else, let us know. Use the email, use the Twitter, use that handy voice memo feature we created, whose link is, quite naturally, also in the show notes. Once again, thank you for joining us and happy listening.